Hello, everyone. Carol Scott with the National Ombudsman Resource Center. This is March the 31st, and this is our March review for the new State Ombudsman call. We are recording this, we are recording this at least for the for the beginning of this call, and I am trying to reduce the size of my, okay, well, I'm going to do this by memory, so this is not good. So we have two people joining us today to talk about the minimum data set. Mark Paul, is that correct, Mark? I didn't ever check with you.
Yeah. Yep, Mark Paul.
Oh, okay, with that G, silent G in it. I love it. So Mark is with the Office of Healthcare Quality in the state of Maryland. And he works with Mary, who is the RAI coordinator for the state of Maryland. And I want to give a shout out to Stevan for connecting me with Mark and Mary. So the plan is these guys are going to talk about the minimum data set and the resident assessment instrument for about 15-20 minutes. We'll have any questions that you guys want to ask, and then we'll let them go and we'll just continue with our regular call. So Mark, take it away.
Hey, everybody. So I'm in the state of Maryland, like Carol said. I'm the acting chief nurse with the state survey agency and the MDS coordinator for the state. Mary is sitting in on the call today too. This is going to be a kind of an overview of the process and how what some of the applications are that could relate to the work that you guys do as ombudsmen. It is a really high level discussion, though. It takes a couple years for somebody to really learn in detail all of the nuances of working with the resident assessment instrument and knowing how to answer all the many questions. But today's just a high-level overview to give you some of the vocabulary and some understanding of the process. So I talk a little bit about the history because that's really important to the purpose of the tool. I'll tell you about the different components and the vocabulary that you'll hear people in the facilities using. So it's helpful to kind of know the basics about what people are talking about in any given time. And then we'll talk about the different applications. So I'm going on to slide 3. And I asked Carol. Carol is able to display the slides so everybody can see them. So she's coordinating, advancing them for us. So when I have a group in front of me, I ask who knows the difference between the RAI and the MDS. Does anybody on the call know?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't.
Well, the MDS, and you'll hear people use them in the nursing homes when you're out. You'll hear people use them sometimes interchangeably. So understanding the context of the discussion helps. But the MDS is really part of the resident assessment instrument. So the RAI is the broader process that ensures that we're doing comprehensive assessments of residents and basing care plans on their assessed needs. And the MDS is one part of that assessment process. So the RAI is evidence-based, it's data-driven, and it's standardized. It includes multiple different functional areas to ensure that when a resident comes into a nursing home, at least all of the primary areas that might be of concern or have been known to be of concern in the past with nursing home residents, at least those functional areas are being covered in the assessment. So the RAI, which is that broader tool, includes the MDS. It includes what's called a care area assessment process, which is a deeper dive in assessing residents in nursing homes. And then it also includes what's called utilization guidelines. That's all of the guidance that is published related to how coordinators conduct the assessments and code the assessments. The MDS manual itself by itself is over 1,000 pages, so it's really very complicated. It's complex. And it's a lot to learn. So the portion that is the MDS is a tool. This is right out of the manual, a core set of screening, clinical, and functional elements. It includes common definitions and coding categories. So it used to be when a resident would come into a nursing home, they could come into a nursing home from the same hospital. Two different residents could come in from the same hospital, and one be admitted to the first floor and one to the second. And they could be coming in with the same diagnosis. The resident who went to the second floor, their admission assessment would be based on the skills and knowledge of the nurse that did the assessment on the second floor. And if that nurse background was primarily in behavioral health, the resident would get a really good psychosocial assessment, and they'd know what their preferences were and any psychosocial needs that may be present for that resident. But maybe not so much their more medical needs. A nurse on the first floor getting another resident with the same diagnosis from the same hospital with more critical care sort of experience might have been doing a very different kind of assessment. So the intent of the development back in the 1980s when this was first really promulgated was to come up with the core things that every assessment, the functional areas that every assessment of every resident should include. And then everybody had to at least meet those minimums to make sure that they were covering all the bases. And the minimum data set itself is the tool. It's the set of questions that get asked in any particular MDS assessment under or within that RAI process. Then the care area assessment, which is the second part of the three components that I'd shown a couple slides ago on slide 7. Once the many questions in the MDS are answered, they get coded into an electronic system. The nursing home MDS coordinator will push a button in the system and it generates care areas that need to be further assessed based on that MDS screening tool. So it's a second, like I said earlier, deeper dive of assessment for residents that's triggered by the questions that get answered in the MDS. So an example, in the MDS, they'll answer questions that include diagnoses. They'll answer questions about nutrition. They'll answer questions about mobility and the general ADL needs, okay? And those three different categories of questions together could trigger a care area for risk of pressure ulcers. So the care areas are not directly, they're not the same as the functional elements in the MDS questions, but they're the triggered care areas where the answers from all the different functional parts of the MDS have triggered a need to look at some particular area of care more closely. The guidelines, in addition to the 1,300-page RAI manual, there's also a state operations manual appendix that has all of the nursing home requirements and guidelines on that. And there's a section within the nursing home requirements that we enforce within my office for nursing homes. There's a particular section of those tags that apply directly to the REI process. And going on to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about the hypothetical patients coming in from a hospital to become nursing home residents. In the 50s, this is really a high-level overview. So in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, there was a lot of research to show that there was problems with the quality of care that people were receiving. And in the next slide, included 1978 was when the Ombudsman program was initiated. And in 1983, this was a key date, a key year for the MDS and the REI process. Research was funded for a large, broad national study to try and identify why the quality of care in nursing homes was as problematic as it was. We had tried a number of different initiatives in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but care was still problematic. And so they funded a national study to see what they could find out. That study came out, the report or results from that study came out in a report that the IOM issued in 1986. And one of the key findings was, like the hypothetical that I had just described, there was not a consistent way that residents were being assessed when they came into nursing homes. And depending on who did the assessment, parts of the assessment might have been really good and parts of the assessments would miss things. And then care plans were not being developed that actually met all the needs of the residents. And that assessment deficit was identified as one of the key findings in this report. And that is what resulted in the decision in 1987 to fund the process and development of the process for the REI. And I have bullets on page 12 about key milestones within nursing homes. And 2010 was when the REI was updated to 3.0, which is the current version that we have now. The big change in 2010 was really increasing the focus on the residents' right to participate in their care planning and in their the care delivery services, the delivery of care they receive. On 13, that's just a reference to the statutory authority that allowed the creation of the REI. And here's just a diagram on 14. So the MDS is different functional areas are evaluated for each resident when they come in. So they fill in one section all their diagnoses, they fill in another section their nutritional needs, they fill in another section on medications, et cetera. And I have all those care areas, or those areas of the MDS are in the PowerPoint that you guys will have access to. Once that's finished, that triggers the comprehensive assessments. From the comprehensive assessments of the nursing homes, make a decision about what needs to be care planned and what does not need to be care planned. And then the delivery of care, when you're in the buildings, the care delivery that you see is supposed to be based on or guided by the care plans, and the care plans should be consistent and congruent with what the assessments from the MDS had provided. The whole point of the process is to try and ensure that the delivery of care to the residents is really tailored to their individualized needs. And so this whole process, which is continuous and circular, tries to ensure that we're really delivering care that's consistent with the plans that are consistent with their assessed needs. And there's ongoing evaluation as the resident care needs change. They should be going back and doing additional assessment and revising care plans. So that's like the big picture of how the process in each nursing home should really be working. You can skip slide 15. these are just regulatory references that on 16 this really applies in Maryland. Okay, and then 17. Beginning on slide 17, these are the functional areas within the MDS. So the MDS assessments are part of the medical record, and the answers to questions in each of these categories can be found in the MDS. And this will provide a picture of where the resident was at the time the assessment was done. So if you're looking at a record and you go into section E to see what was going on with behaviors, keep in mind that that might not be what is going on right now. If the last MDS assessment that was done was 2 months ago, it's a picture of where behaviors, or where they stood with regard to all the questions related to behaviors at the time that it was actually completed. But there is lots of rich data and information available in the record in the MDS assessments under the many questions for each of these categories, depending on what resident you're working with and what sorts of issues may be going on in the building or with the resident. It can be a really good tool to further assess and understand where the resident is and what their needs are. Section G here, functional status. In October, is it October that it goes away, Mary?
Yes, October 1st of this
Yeah.
year.
October, okay. I thought it was October. So section G is being updated with a new section called GG, and section G won't be anymore after October. Section G was really a challenge for coordinators to code. I used to tell people when I taught section G, I don't know if Mary, you've ever heard this, when I would teach classes in the state, I would tell the coordinators that in order to learn section G, the prerequisite is to take at least one volume. And then I told them, if you ever have to teach it, you get to take 2.
That's a good one.
It was very, very difficult and complicated. So section I is where you'll find all the diagnoses. Health conditions in section J, if they have a fall history, there are a number of miscellaneous things that fall under health conditions in section G. K is nutrition. Anybody at risk for pressure ulcers or with skin conditions, you're going to find information about their assessment regarding skin conditions in section M. Section N is medications. That includes near and dear to me and Stevan. That includes information about antipsychotics that were in use at the time of the assessment for that particular resident. There's a section on restraints. If restraints are being used, it has to be documented in the MDS. And restraints in themselves are a really, really complicated topic within the regulations. We don't say that restraints cannot be used, but if they're going to be used, they have to be clinically justified. And there's all kinds of things that need to be done to support the resident if, in fact, restraints do need to be used. And a lot of the nursing homes throughout the country now call themselves restraint-free. Sometimes that's accurate, sometimes not. Okay. So then going on to slide 20. So MDS data is part of the medical record. Anytime that you're in a facility, if you have access to and you're reviewing a medical record, keep in mind that the MDS, just like all of the medical record, is confidential information, and there's all kinds of obligations that arise with the accessing that information, and that's important to be aware of if you're in the facility providing assistance as an MDS. There are records within the MDS when a patient comes in. Excuse me. and when they're discharged. So I had to get some water. This is really important in the quality application that we'll talk about in a minute. We need to know when the resident came in, and we need to know when the resident left the building if they were discharged. Sometimes they're discharged to a hospital and they come back. Sometimes they're discharged and they don't come back. Those are important markers when the MDS data is used for quality reporting that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But just keep in mind that we do track when they come in and when they leave in the MDS process. So the applications, which I think is helpful for you guys to know, the what's called OBRA assessments, which is I think it could have been named something better. It's called OBRA because it arose out of the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1987, so it's not very descriptive.
Girls.
I thought Mary had a question. So those assessments screen the residents' needs, they trigger the care areas, they guide the care planning, and that's what we were talking about in the general process. There used to also be separate assessments for payment, but the OBRA assessments are the clinical assessments that we're talking about today. Care planning is the process that we have here crafts the how of resident care. So care plans are going to describe how the staff on the floor are going to deliver care consistent with what the assessed needs of the resident are. So an example there, it really needs to be individualized to resident. So if I have a resident who is 90-year-old female, she's had 3 falls with injuries, she's afraid of falling, she's forgetful, and she uses a walker, but she doesn't remember. And she says, please remind me because I keep forgetting and I'm terrified I'm going to fall. Her care plan is going to include that staff should be monitoring her and reminding her when she doesn't have the walker related to her falls risk. I have another resident on the same floor, on the same unit, who's the same age, and she's also a fall risk. And she says she doesn't want to use the walker. It's her dignity and her right to not be seen walking around with a walker. She doesn't want to hear about it. You've told me about it and stop talking about it. The care plan for that resident is going to be very different because they're going to need to craft a care plan that respects the fact that the second resident really does not want to use the walker, and we need to respect their freedom of choice in the delivery of care and services they receive. So the care plans are necessarily going to be very different depending on the actual assessed needs of the resident. For payment, one of the applications from the MDS assessments, depending on how different questions are answered and how dependent the residents are and how much assistance they need, et cetera, all of that's going to go into very complicated algorithms that determine the payment rates that get paid for the nursing home. And it's a very complicated process, but the MDS provides the data that determines the acuity that gets interpreted into payment rates. So that's one of the applications from the MDS. And the first one I talked about earlier was the, I don't know if I should say it's the most important, but it's the most important in terms of quality of care is the way that it drives the care planning process and ensures that the needs of the residents are really individualized. Quality, there are quality measures that are publicly reported, and the quality measures are derived from the MDS data. So if you're going into a particular nursing home, you can look that nursing home up online and you can see what their quality measures look like. One of the quality measures, just as an example, and I know we don't have a lot of time today, but one is the number of pressure ulcers or the percentage of residents with pressure ulcers that were acquired in the nursing home. That's pulled out of the MDS, and the way that we get that data is we know the date that they came in. We know from the assessment on the day they came in whether or not they had pressure ulcers, and we know when they're discharged whether or not they had pressure ulcers. So the data in the MDS is what's helping to inform the various quality measures that are publicly reported data, and that's data that's available, well, publicly, but important data to be aware of in your role as ombuds people. So the quality measures are used by the nursing homes because they can better understand where they need to focus their quality improvement efforts. Quality measures are used by CMS. When I'm going to be going in on a survey, if I have a number of complaints about a particular topic and it's related to quality measure data, I'm probably going to go look at the quality data that is publicly available for what I'm going to be going in and looking at under a complaint. So CMS tracks it as well. CMS at the federal level also tracks it to better understand where national education should be focusing to improve care, and to better understand, are there particular targeted enforcement areas that we should be looking at? So there's targeted enforcement right now for the use of antipsychotic medications. And in part, that's because of data that we have from the MDS on the usage of antipsychotics. We also have information on how often nursing homes are cited related to inappropriate antipsychotic use, which is another metric that CMS has available for their long-term focus and planning. So that's kind of a really quick 15-minute overview, and I think I talked for 20, about what it is and how it works, why it was created and what the intent is, a little bit about the different categorical areas that are in the MDS that are in the record that might provide information that help you understanding the assessed needs of residents you work with, and some of the applications and that's available. So do you guys have any questions? I think I've already gone a little over, which is fine for me, but do you have any questions? We could.
Absolutely, Mark, that's kind of like explaining the ombudsman program in 3 minutes or less. This is very, very complicated. Camille, do you have a question or comment?
Well, I wanted to thank him, and I think there's probably my memory is that there's probably multiple places, but because ombudsmen generally deal with things like you were telling the story about the two women that might have had very similar assessments functionally and things like that, but two different preferences as to how their care plan would look. So what sections would we generally find that would be captured in to be put into the care plan?
It's going to be, it's actually pulled from multiple areas of the MDS.
Okay.
So if somebody's at risk for pressure ulcer, there's many different things that might cause that. If somebody's at risk for falls, there's many things that may be important to consider in developing a plan. So there isn't necessarily one specific place where you can go get an answer on what was the specific assessed issue that led to a care plan.
I was honing in on that part, sir. I was honing in on that part where they stated their preference of how they wanted it dealt with, whether or not they wanted to be reminded, or my dignity and respect is important to me, that people not say that to me. Where would that be captured?
There's a section in the MDS under section F where they grade and score specific preferences. There's also there's also gonna be care planning notes when they have care planning meetings that the residents should be able to participate in. So those are, I guess, the key areas where you'd find that.
I appreciate it. I didn't know, since you said you taught it, I thought too, that might be, I know a lot of the individuals really like a checklist that you're teaching, or we're all teaching. Yeah. And I just wondered where we might help them, know that they could place that information to help the care planning. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and from the regulatory perspective, facilities develop their own policies and their own systems for tracking, and they can be very different from one building to another. Some places are gonna they may have different systems for how they track different categories of information and how they link it and who has access to it. So it's not necessarily always going to be in the same place. It's really going to depend on the facility you're in. I go into a nursing home and I have to ask, there's a sign on the door for bed A and B. You always ask because in one building, bed A is the closest to the door, and in another building, bed A is closer to the window. So a lot of the structural systems for documentation is like that, where it really is specific to the nursing home, and how they implement their own systems to meet the requirements is up to them. So it's not an easy you go look here and this is where you'll find it necessarily.
So Mark, when you look at an MDS, are you only seeing the latest one, or is there a way to, or is it such that you can see over time things that have changed?
So when it came out in 1987 and was then first implemented in the early 90s, it was funds were appropriated in 87, but when it first came out, there weren't a lot of electronic records, and the requirement was that there had to be 15 months of MDS assessments, and they're conducted at least every 3 months. So it would be a number of prior MDS assessments that had to be kept in the medical record. As more and more of us went to electronic records, there's often a history that's longer than that available in the nursing home because there's not a lot of paper that they need to keep managing. But there is an MDS assessment completed at least quarterly. So depending on how long a particular resident has been in the building, there may be a lengthy history showing change over time from when they first came in to their current status. It'll depend on how long they've been there. But there is still a requirement that there has to be at least 15 months of historical MDS data available in the record, assuming they've been there that long.
Okay, thank you. So another
Sure.
question. So typically state ombudsmen are not going into a nursing home and looking at the records and asking to look at the MDS. It's their representatives, their local ombudsman. In their state, who should they have a relationship with, and who would be the best person perhaps to invite to a meeting that they are having with their local people to talk about exactly what you were telling us? Is that Mary in each state?
I don't know of anybody on the regulatory side who would actually come in and attend the care plan meetings and that sort of thing. Our role is, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I maybe didn't make that clear. If if Camille in Kansas wanted to teach her local ombudsman about the MDS and what parts to look at, who would they approach in their state to come and do training for the ombudsman that will actually be going out and looking at an MDS?
There's a federal state REI coordinator in each state. And I can send, there's an appendix in the REI manual that lists the current persons who are in those roles in every state, which I could
Oh.
give to Carol.
Perfect.
And that would be where I would start.
So you ombudsman, do you know who your RAI coordinator is? Okay, I'm seeing at least one head shake, but that's the only head I can see because everyone else is hiding behind their cameras. Okay, there.
Yeah, and
Lisa's-
part of the role of the I was the REI coordinator in Maryland for about 5 years. Part of the role is doing stakeholder outreach and education.
Excellent. So you said that that MDS is part of the medical records. So if we, I mean, and we only can look at records with the permission of the resident. So
Correct.
I'm assuming that the care plan and the MDS and the social worker notes and the nursing notes, all the prescription drugs are all in the same file under a
Yes.
resident's name?
Yeah, they're going to all be part of that same medical record. And I know the ombudsman programs have restricted access and the need to have permission to go into them. But I know also that sometimes that you do, and it can be helpful.
Yeah, I'm thinking there are limited numbers of times that that ombudsman
Yeah,
would need
sure.
to look at them. But, you know, somebody's complaining that they've been diagnosed with schizophrenia. It would be interesting to look in a medical record for kind of where that diagnosis occurred, how it happened and everything. Other questions or
Yeah.
comments?
In Maryland, we have the survey agency has a really good relationship with the ombudsman program, and I know we'll often receive concerns that come in that we can open as complaints and we can go out and look at under survey authority. But our role is prescribed very differently. Those of you who are going into the buildings as ombuds people, you can talk to the facilities about best practices and how things that might be able to be done to improve care for a particular residents that you're working with. Because we're the enforcement authority and we issue citations when minimum standards aren't met, we're really strictly prohibited from doing anything outside of that prescribed role. So our investigators are going to be trained to identify where minimum standards aren't met, and they'll issue citations, and we receive plans of correction to ensure that they at least come up to minimum standards. So our focus and role is more prescribed, and we're not able to share best practices or help facilities to correct things when they need correction. You actually have more leeway in that regard, in being able to accomplish a little bit more in terms of advocating and helping the residents.
So that leads to an interesting conversation. If the state survey agency was seeing a trend in either a facility or multiple facilities and they're not able to provide education and assistance, could they have a conversation with the ombudsman program to just say, without mentioning names or maybe even facilities, could they say, this is something that we're seeing? Here are a few, best practices. Could the ombudsman give help the facility?
The short answer is yes, the ombudsman could help. It varies a little bit, or it may vary more than I know, by state. Here, anytime that we issue citations, copies of those citations actually go to the ombudsman program manager or the ombudsman's office. So they're regularly apprised and updated on issues that we've seen. So they would be aware of trends even without necessarily getting on the phone and having a monthly call to talk, because they actually get copies of deficiency statements when they go out.
Correct.
I don't know
correct.
if that's a nationwide standard or if that's a state standard here.
It's supposed to be nationwide.
Okay.
From state to state, it tends to vary. Okay, well, hey, Mark, and I see that Mary's already had to leave us, but Mark, thank you so much. This has been
sure.
This I
I hope
actually
it's
learned
helpful.
extremely helpful. Want to thank you for joining with us today, and we'll give a shout out to Stevan for connecting us with you. So thank you very much. I'm
Okay.
gonna hit the stop record.
Okay. Thanks,
But
Dawn.
I'm actually gonna. Sorry, I got my phone ringing. Okay, how do I?
Well, thanks everybody and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.